There's something strange happening in Europe right now. Not a war, not a crash, not a moment you can point to on a calendar and say, that's when it changed. It's quieter than that. It's the kind of thing you notice when you've been away for a few years and then come back. The streets look the same, the cafes are still full, the architecture is still beautiful. But something underneath has shifted, something in the weight of the place. GDP numbers still look respectable on paper. Politicians still talk about resilience and recovery. The euro is still standing. But if you talk to a German engineer in his 50s, or a French entrepreneur who gave up and moved to Dubai, or a Portuguese economist who stopped believing the projections, they'll all tell you something the headlines won't. Europe is losing ground, and it has been for a while. The question isn't whether it's happening. The question is why nobody seems to want to say it out loud. That's what this video is about. Let's start with something most people get wrong about Europe. When Americans think about European decline, they tend to think about it in political terms: left versus right, immigration, culture wars, the usual noise. And while those things are real, they're not the engine of what's happening. They're the symptoms. The actual story is structural, and it goes much deeper than any election cycle. Here's the thing about systems: they don't collapse dramatically. They erode, slowly, quietly, in ways that are easy to rationalize away year after year, until one day you look around and realize the margin is gone. Europe built one of the most sophisticated economic systems in human history: universal healthcare, strong labor protections, generous pensions, long vacations, high quality of life. And for decades, it worked. It worked beautifully. There was a period, roughly from the post-war reconstruction through the 1990s, where Europe wasn't just recovering, it was genuinely competing with America for the future. Then, something changed. Not overnight, not because of one bad decision or one corrupt leader, but because the system that had been built for one era started running in a different one, and nobody wanted to be the person who said it. Think about what Europe built its prosperity on after 1945. 3 pillars, essentially. American security guarantees through NATO, which meant European governments didn't have to spend heavily on defense. Cheap Russian energy, which powered German industry, kept utility bills manageable, and made European manufacturing globally competitive. And open access to global markets, particularly the American consumer market, which absorbed European exports and kept the growth engine running. 3 pillars. All 3 are now either gone or severely compromised. The American security umbrella is no longer free. Washington has been signaling for years, loudly under Trump, more diplomatically under others, that Europe needs to carry more of its own weight. And Europe, structurally, fiscally, and politically, is not ready for that conversation. The Russian energy relationship ended in 2022 with a brutality that caught many European policymakers genuinely off guard. Not because they didn't see Russia's aggression coming, many did, but because the depth of the dependency was uncomfortable to acknowledge. Germany had built an entire industrial philosophy around cheap gas. That philosophy is now in ruins. German industrial output has been contracting. The country that was supposed to be the locomotive of European growth is struggling to find a new engine. And global markets? They're reorganizing. Supply chains that once flowed naturally through Europe are being rerouted. American industrial policy, particularly under the Inflation Reduction Act, is pulling investment and manufacturing back across the Atlantic. Companies that would have built in Europe are building in the American South instead. The incentives shifted, capital followed. Now here's what makes this particularly difficult to address. Each of these 3 pillars eroded for different reasons, on different timelines, driven by different forces. which means there's no single villain, no clean narrative, no obvious fix, just a slow, compound erosion of the conditions that made the European model work. And European institutions, the EU bureaucracy in Brussels, the national governments in Berlin and Paris and Rome, were not designed for speed. They were designed for consensus, for stability, for managing complexity across 27 different countries with 27 different political cultures and 27 different sets of voters who need to be kept reasonably happy. Consensus is a beautiful thing when the world is stable. It's a liability when the world is moving fast. And right now, the world is moving very fast. There's a concept in systems thinking called brittleness. It's different from weakness. A brittle system can look strong, even dominant, right up until the moment it breaks. It doesn't bend. It doesn't adapt gradually. It holds and holds and holds, and then it doesn't. Europe's economic model has some of that brittleness built in. Not because Europeans are lazy or foolish. That's the cheap version of this argument, and it's wrong. But because the model was optimized for a world that no longer exists. And optimized systems are, almost by definition, fragile when conditions change. The engineers understand this. The economists understand this. Some of the more honest politicians understand this. But understanding something and acting on it are two very different things. Especially when acting on it means telling your voters that the comfortable arrangement they've built their lives around needs to fundamentally change. That's a conversation most politicians in any democracy will delay as long as possible. And delay, in a slow erosion, is the most expensive choice of all. There's a number that doesn't get talked about enough in conversations about Europe. Productivity growth. Not GDP, not unemployment rates, not trade balances. Productivity. The rate at which an economy generates more output from the same amount of input, more value from the same hours worked, more innovation from the same investment, more growth from the same foundation. It's not a glamorous metric. It doesn't make headlines. Politicians don't give speeches about it. But it is, quietly, the most important number in any economy over the long run. Because productivity growth is what determines whether living standards rise or stagnate, whether a country can afford its promises to its citizens, whether a society is building towards something or slowly spending down what previous generations built. And Europe's productivity growth, for the better part of 2 decades, has been deeply, structurally disappointing. Let me put some texture around that. In the 1990s, European productivity was growing at a pace that genuinely threatened American economic dominance. There was serious academic debate about whether the European model, with its emphasis on social cohesion, long-term thinking, and coordinated industrial policy, might actually outperform the more chaotic, inequality-prone American approach over time. That debate has mostly gone quiet. Not because it was resolved cleanly, but because the data started telling a different story. Since roughly 2005, the productivity gap between the United States and the European Union has been widening. Not collapsing, widening. Slowly, consistently, year after year. And the widening accelerated after 2010, during and after the Eurozone debt crisis, when European economies were forced into years of austerity, precisely at the moment when investment in the future was most needed. Here's the mechanism. When an economy goes through a period of severe fiscal constraint, when governments cut spending to manage debt, The cuts don't fall evenly. The things that get cut first are rarely the things that feel urgent today. They're the things that matter in 10 years. Research and development, education quality, infrastructure, digital transformation. The long horizon investments that don't show up on next quarter's balance sheet, but determine whether your economy is competitive in the next decade. Europe cut those things. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but enough. And it's paying the price now in the form of a technology sector that, by global standards, is remarkably thin. Think about this for a moment. The largest technology companies in the world are American or Chinese. The platforms that organize global commerce, global communication, global information, they were built in California and Beijing and Seattle. Not in Berlin, not in Stockholm, not in Amsterdam, despite Stockholm producing more unicorns per capita than almost anywhere on Earth. Europe has talent, extraordinary talent, but it exports that talent rather than scaling it. The pattern is almost clockwork. A European startup gets to a certain size, hits the limits of a fragmented market with 27 different regulatory environments and 27 different consumer cultures, and then either sells to an American company or moves its headquarters to the United States to access deeper capital markets. The talent stays, the value creation leaves. This is not a secret. European policymakers have been writing reports about it for years. The European Commission has commissioned studies. Think tanks have published recommendations. The diagnosis has been made, repeatedly, with considerable sophistication. But diagnosis is not treatment. The structural obstacles to building a genuine European technology ecosystem are formidable. Fragmented capital markets mean European venture funding is a fraction of American levels. Regulatory complexity means that scaling across the continent requires navigating a legal labyrinth that American companies operating in one unified market simply don't face. Cultural attitudes toward failure, still more stigmatized in much of Europe than in the United States, affect the risk appetite of founders and investors alike. And then there's the question of where the most ambitious people go. This is the part that's hardest to quantify, but perhaps most important to understand. Economies are not just systems of capital and regulation. They're ecosystems of human ambition. And human ambition, like capital, flows toward environments that reward it. For a certain kind of European, young, technically skilled, entrepreneurially inclined, globally minded, the calculus has become increasingly clear. If you want to build something at scale, if you want access to the deepest pools of capital and the most dynamic markets, if you want to be surrounded by others doing the same thing at the same intensity, you leave. Not because Europe is unpleasant. Europe is often extraordinarily pleasant. That's almost the point. Pleasantness and dynamism are not the same thing. And in an era where the returns to dynamism have never been higher, pleasantness alone is not enough to retain the people who drive productivity forward. There's a phrase economists use, brain drain, that sounds almost clinical, detached. But it describes something deeply human. It describes a young engineer from Munich or Milan or Madrid making a rational calculation about where their life will compound fastest. And increasingly, that calculation points west or east toward the Gulf, or south toward cities that are building fast and don't ask you to navigate decades of accumulated institutional inertia. Europe is losing that argument, quietly, consistently, and the loss compounds. Because the people who leave are often the people who would have built the companies that would have retained the next generation of talent. Ecosystems require density. When density thins, the whole system weakens. This is the productivity trap. It doesn't feel like a crisis from the inside. It feels like a series of reasonable individual decisions. Reasonable decisions that add up over time to a structural problem that becomes harder and harder to reverse. There's a conversation Europe is not having. Not loudly anyway. Not honestly. Not in the way that the scale of the problem demands. It's the conversation about people. Not immigration, though that's part of it. Not birth rates as a political talking point, though that gets weaponized constantly. The real conversation, the one underneath the noise, about what happens to an economic system when the population that built it starts to age faster than the population replacing it. Because that's what's happening across Europe right now. And it's happening at a speed and at a scale that most people, even well-informed people, haven't fully internalized. Let me give you the shape of it. In 1970, for every person over the age of 65 in Europe, there were roughly 5 working-age adults supporting the tax base, paying into pension systems, generating the economic activity that funded public services. 5 to 1. That ratio made the European social model viable. It made generous pensions affordable. It made universal healthcare sustainable. It made long parental leave and early retirement and extensive unemployment protection possible. Because there were enough productive workers in the system to carry the weight. That ratio is now closer to 3 to 1 across much of Europe. In some countries, Italy, Greece, Portugal, parts of Eastern Europe, it's heading toward 2 to 1 within the next 15 to 20 years. 2 working-age adults for every retiree. Sit with that for a moment, not as a statistic, as a structural reality, as a weight that those 2 adults have to carry, in taxes, in healthcare costs, in pension obligations, while also trying to invest in their own futures, raise their own children, and compete in a global economy that is not slowing down to accommodate demographic transition. The math of this is unforgiving, and the math has been known for decades. The post-war baby boom that powered European prosperity through the latter half of the 20th century was always going to become a retirement wave. Demographers saw it coming. Economists modeled it. Policy researchers wrote papers about it. The projections were not hidden. They were published, presented at conferences, submitted to governments, filed in the archives of every major European finance ministry. And yet, the political response across most of Europe has been to manage the edges rather than confront the center. Pension ages have been nudged upward, slowly, painfully, against enormous political resistance. France nearly broke apart over it in 2023. Greece was forced into brutal reforms by external creditors during the debt crisis, not by internal political will. Italy has been running pension deficits for years and continues to offer early retirement arrangements that are fiscally extraordinary given its demographic profile. Why? Because the people who vote in European elections are, increasingly, the people who benefit from the existing system. The median voter in Germany is in their mid-50s. In Italy, older still. These are not people who are naturally inclined to vote for the dismantling of arrangements they spent their working lives paying into and expecting to receive. This is not a moral failing. It's a structural feature of democratic systems. People vote their interests. And when the electorate skews old, policy skews toward protecting what the old have built, at the expense of investing in what the young might build. The young, meanwhile, are making their own calculations. A 28-year-old in Spain, facing youth unemployment that has persistently hovered around 20%, even in relatively good economic times, paying into a pension system she intellectually understands may not be there in its current form when she reaches retirement age, navigating a housing market where prices have been driven up by asset inflation while wages have stagnated. That person is not building a life oriented around the European social contract. She's building an exit strategy. And this connects back to everything we talked about in the last block. The productivity crisis and the demographic crisis are not separate problems. They are the same problem, expressed in different dimensions. When young, skilled, ambitious people leave or disengage, the tax base narrows, the pension burden concentrates on fewer shoulders, and the political economy becomes even more dominated by older voters protecting existing arrangements. It's a cycle, and cycles, once established, have momentum. Now, immigration. This is where the conversation gets complicated, and I want to be precise here, because precision matters more than comfort. Immigration is the arithmetic solution to demographic decline. More people, more workers, more taxpayers, more economic activity. The math is straightforward. And Europe has been receiving immigration, substantial immigration, for decades. But immigration as a demographic solution requires something that's harder than just opening borders. It requires integration, real integration, economic integration, where immigrants have genuine access to the labor market at skill levels that match their capabilities. Social integration, where the second generation grows up with full participation in the economic and civic life of the country. Educational integration, where children of immigrants have the same realistic prospects as children of native-born citizens. And on that deeper measure, not arrival, but integration, Europe's record is genuinely mixed. In some countries and some contexts, it works well. In others, the pattern is persistent marginalization. Immigrants concentrated in low-wage sectors. Second generations experiencing discrimination in hiring. Parallel communities that exist alongside the mainstream economy rather than inside it. This is not a story about culture or values. It's a story about institutions, about whether the systems that are supposed to create equal opportunity actually function equally. And the evidence across much of Europe suggests they often don't. Which means Europe is facing a demographic crisis with an arithmetic solution that its institutions are not fully equipped to execute, in a political environment where the topic has become so charged that honest conversation about it is almost impossible. That's a very difficult place to be. And it becomes more difficult with each year that passes without the structural reforms that would require the current generation of voters to accept short-term costs for long-term stability. History is full of societies that knew what they needed to do and couldn't bring themselves to do it. Not because they lacked intelligence, but because the political cost of the necessary action was higher than any individual leader was willing to pay. Europe is not there yet, but it's closer than the official optimism suggests. Here's a question worth sitting with. When was the last time you used a European technology product? Not a European car, not a European pharmaceutical, not European engineering on an infrastructure project somewhere. Those are real and they matter. But a technology product, a platform, an application, something that organizes how you communicate, how you shop, how you consume information, how you move through the world. Take a moment. Think about it genuinely. Your phone is American or Korean. The operating system is American. The search engine is American. The social media platforms are American. The e-commerce platform you bought something on this week is American. The streaming service you watched last night is American. The AI tools that are beginning to reorganize how knowledge work gets done, American, with a rapidly growing Chinese challenger. Europe is largely absent from that list. Not entirely, not without exceptions, but absent in a way that is structurally significant, in a way that tells you something important about where value is being created in the 21st century economy and where it isn't. This matters more than it might initially seem, because we are living through a moment in economic history where the returns to technology, specifically to software platforms, artificial intelligence, and data-driven business models, are unlike anything seen since the Industrial Revolution. The companies that own these platforms don't just make money, they set the rules. They capture an extraordinary share of global economic value. They determine what information people see, how commerce flows, how labor markets function, how capital allocates itself. Owning that layer of the global economy is not just a business advantage, it's a form of power, geopolitical power, the kind of power that shapes the century. And Europe doesn't own it. Now, why not? This is where it gets interesting, because the answer is not simple, and the simple answers that get repeated most often are mostly wrong. The simple answer is regulation. Europe over-regulates. The GDPR, the Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, Brussels bureaucrats strangling innovation with compliance requirements, while American companies move fast and break things. You hear this argument constantly, particularly from American technology executives who have found European regulators inconvenient. There's something to it. Regulatory compliance does add friction. Friction does slow things down. And some European regulations have been blunt instruments that created costs without proportionate benefits. But regulation is not the primary explanation, and here's why. If regulation were the core problem, you'd expect to see European technology companies dominating markets outside Europe, in regions with lighter regulatory environments. You don't see that. The gap is not primarily regulatory. It's structural, and it runs deeper. The real explanation has several layers, and each layer connects to things we've already discussed. The first layer is capital. Building a technology company at global scale requires access to large amounts of patient, risk-tolerant capital at the right stages of growth. Venture capital, growth equity, deep public markets willing to value high-growth, low-profit businesses on their future potential rather than their current earnings. European capital markets are fragmented, risk-averse, and oriented toward established industries. European venture capital, while growing, remains a fraction of American levels in absolute terms. A European startup that reaches the growth stage, where it needs $50, $100, $200 million to scale aggressively, frequently finds that the capital simply isn't available domestically at the terms that growth requires. So it goes to American investors. And American investors, reasonably enough, often want the company closer to their ecosystem. Headquarters move, teams follow, value migrates. The second layer is market size. The American domestic market is 330 million people who largely share a language, a legal system, a consumer culture, and a regulatory environment. A company that cracks the American market has access to an enormous, unified pool of customers. Europe has roughly 450 million people in the EU, but they speak 24 official languages. They operate under different national legal systems, layered beneath EU frameworks. They have different consumer preferences, different payment systems, different cultural relationships with technology adoption. Selling to Europe is not one thing. It's 27 things happening simultaneously with 27 different localizations and 27 different regulatory nuances. That fragmentation is a tax on scale. It makes the unit economics of building a European technology company structurally harder than building an American one. Every additional country is a project. Every additional language is a cost. Every additional regulatory environment is a compliance burden. The friction compounds at exactly the moment when the company most needs to move fast. The third layer is the one that's hardest to talk about honestly. Culture and incentive structures around ambition, risk, and failure. Building a technology company at scale is an extraordinarily difficult, high-risk endeavor. The majority fail. The ones that succeed often do so after multiple near-death experiences, pivots, brutal fundraising cycles, and years of uncertainty that would break most people. The environments that produce the most of these companies are environments where the attempt is respected, where failure is not permanent, where the social and financial cost of trying and not making it is manageable, where starting a company that fails doesn't ruin your career or your creditworthiness or your social standing. Silicon Valley built that culture over decades. It's imperfect, and it has its own pathologies, but it is genuinely distinctive in its tolerance for risk and its valorization of the attempt. Parts of Europe are developing similar cultures. London, Stockholm, Berlin to some extent, Amsterdam. Tallinn, remarkably, has built a startup ecosystem that punches far above its weight. These are real and they matter. But they exist within broader cultural and institutional contexts that still carry significant stigma around failure, that still orient ambitious young people toward established professional paths, law, medicine, finance, large corporations, rather than toward the uncertainty of building something new. And then there's the question of what happens at the intersection of this innovation deficit and the forces we've already discussed. Aging population, productivity stagnation, energy cost disadvantage, brain drain. These things don't add, they multiply. An economy with aging demographics needs productivity growth more urgently than a young, dynamic economy, because it has fewer workers to generate value. An economy losing its most ambitious people to emigration loses precisely the people most likely to drive technological innovation. An economy with high energy costs has a competitive disadvantage in the energy-intensive computing infrastructure that underpins modern technology at scale. Every weakness connects to every other weakness. Every deficit compounds every other deficit. And yet, and this is important, Europe is not without assets in this space. European research universities are genuinely world-class. The scientific talent being produced in European institutions is extraordinary. DeepMind, one of the most important artificial intelligence research organizations in the world, was founded in London. Spotify came from Stockholm. ASML, the Dutch company that makes the machines that make the chips that make everything else possible, is arguably the most strategically important technology company in the world right now, and it's European. These are not footnotes. They're evidence that the capability exists. The question is whether the ecosystem around that capability, the capital, the market structure, the regulatory environment, the cultural incentives, can be rebuilt fast enough to capture the value that the capability could create. Because right now, Europe is very good at producing the seeds of technological leadership and then watching those seeds get planted somewhere else. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that sets in when you've understood a problem for a long time and watched nothing happen. Not ignorance, not denial, exhaustion. I think a lot of serious Europeans, economists, policymakers, business leaders, engineers who thought carefully about these things, are living in that exhaustion right now. They know what the problems are. They've known for years. They've written the reports. They've sat in the meetings. They've made the arguments. And they've watched the political system absorb those arguments, process them, and produce, mostly, inaction. This is the part of the story that's hardest to explain to someone outside it, because from the outside, European political dysfunction can look like incompetence, or corruption, or simple cowardice. But it's more structural than that, and understanding the structure matters if you want to understand why reform is so genuinely difficult, not just politically uncomfortable, but architecturally constrained. Start with the European Union itself. The EU is one of the most remarkable political constructions in human history. 27 sovereign nations with deeply different histories, languages, economic structures, and political cultures, operating under a shared legal and institutional framework, trading freely, moving freely, with a common currency across 20 of them. That achievement should not be minimized. In historical terms, it is extraordinary. But the architecture that makes that achievement possible also makes rapid, decisive action nearly impossible. Major economic reforms at the EU level require consensus, or near consensus, among member states whose interests frequently diverge. The fiscal priorities of frugal northern countries, Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, are structurally different from those of southern countries carrying heavier debt loads. The industrial interests of France don't always align with those of Poland. The energy security concerns of the Baltic states are not the same as those of Spain. Getting 27 governments to agree on anything beyond the most basic principles requires negotiation that takes years. By the time consensus is reached, the world has moved. The original diagnosis may still be accurate, but the specific prescription has been overtaken by events. This is not a bug in the European system, it's a feature. The design prioritizes preventing any single country or bloc from dominating the others over enabling fast collective action. Given European history, given what happened the last time one country tried to impose its will on the continent, that design priority makes profound sense. But it comes at a cost, and the cost is measured in years of delayed reform, in half measures, in compromises that satisfy no one fully and solve nothing completely. Now layer onto that the dynamics within individual national governments. Germany is the most instructive case because Germany is the largest European economy and has been the implicit anchor of the European project for decades. What happens in Germany matters everywhere. Germany built its post-war prosperity on a specific model: manufacturing excellence, engineering precision, export orientation, a strong Mittelstand, the ecosystem of medium-sized family businesses that form the backbone of German industrial capacity. Highly skilled labor, long time horizons, patience. That model worked brilliantly for 50 years. It made Germany wealthy, stable, and globally respected. It was also built on the three pillars we discussed in the beginning: American security, cheap Russian energy, open global markets. And it was specifically optimized for a world where China was a growing market for German goods, rather than a competitor for German market share. All of those assumptions have now been challenged simultaneously. Russian energy is gone. American security guarantees are conditional in ways they weren't before. China has gone from being the destination for German cars and machinery to building its own cars and machinery, often better and cheaper, and selling them back into global markets that German companies used to own. The German political system's response to this has been, to put it charitably, halting. The coalition government that fell apart in late 2024 spent much of its existence in internal disagreement about whether and how to respond to the structural challenges facing the German economy. The debates were real and the disagreements were genuine, but the output, in terms of actual policy change at the scale the situation demanded, was inadequate. And Germany is not alone. France has been wrestling with pension reform for decades, and when it finally moved, partially, incrementally, it triggered the largest wave of social unrest in a generation. Italy's political system cycles through governments with a regularity that makes sustained long-term reform nearly impossible. Spain is governing with a minority coalition that requires constant negotiation just to pass a budget. These are not weak countries run by stupid people. They are complex democracies trying to manage genuine tensions between competing interests in an environment where the costs of necessary change fall on groups that are politically powerful enough to resist. Here is the tension at the heart of it. The reforms that Europe needs, in pensions, in energy, in capital markets, in education, in regulatory architecture, would require asking current voters to accept real costs for benefits that will materialize over a decade or more. Higher retirement ages, reallocation of public spending from consumption to investment, regulatory harmonization that reduces national autonomy, energy transition costs that fall on households and businesses now, before the long-term benefits of energy independence arrive. These are not unreasonable asks in the abstract. In the abstract, most thoughtful Europeans understand the logic. The polls consistently show that Europeans are aware their economies face serious challenges. But awareness and political consent for painful action are very different things. Knowing that something is necessary and voting for the politician who will actually do it are separated by a very wide gap, because the politician who does it will be blamed for the pain, and the politician who promises to protect you from the pain will be rewarded. This is not uniquely European. It's a feature of democratic politics everywhere, in every era. But it interacts particularly badly with Europe's specific situation, because the longer the reforms are delayed, the more expensive they become. The demographic window for relatively manageable pension adjustment is closing. The productivity gap with the United States widens every year that the technology ecosystem doesn't develop. The energy vulnerability doesn't resolve itself. The brain drain continues. Delay is not neutral. Delay is a choice, and it has a compounding cost. There is one more dimension to the political paralysis that deserves attention, and it's the rise of political forces across the European spectrum, from hard left to hard right, that are responding to genuine public anxiety about economic stagnation by offering explanations and solutions that feel emotionally satisfying but are structurally counterproductive. Protectionism, nationalism, scapegoating of immigrants or elites or Brussels technocrats. Promises to restore a version of the past that cannot be restored because the conditions that made it possible no longer exist. These movements are not rising because Europeans are irrational. They're rising because the mainstream political establishment has failed to deliver the security and prosperity that people reasonably expect. When the centre cannot hold, when the parties that have governed for decades cannot arrest visible decline, people look for alternatives. And the alternatives on offer, almost universally, make the structural problems worse rather than better. More fragmentation, more protectionism, more resistance to the integration and investment and reform that might actually address the underlying issues. It's a feedback loop. Decline produces political instability. Political instability produces policies that accelerate decline, which produces more instability. Europe has been here before. Not exactly here, the specifics are always different, but this pattern of a political system unable to process the scale of the challenge it faces, producing responses that are inadequate or counterproductive until something forces a reckoning. Europe knows this pattern from its own history. The question is whether it can find a different way through it this time. If you've made it this far with me, through the productivity numbers, through the demographic math, through the political architecture, through all of it, I want to pause for a moment. Not to summarize. You don't need a summary. You've been thinking alongside me this whole time, and I can tell you've been taking this seriously. I just want to say, if this kind of analysis matters to you, if understanding the real forces shaping the world feels important rather than optional, subscribe to this channel. Hit that button, because this is what we do here. Not headlines, not hot takes, not outrage optimized for clicks. We try to understand how the world actually works, and we do it every week. That's the only ask. Now, back to Europe, because we're not done. And what comes next is the part most analysts skip. Everyone can diagnose decline. The harder question, the one that actually matters, is whether decline is destiny. And here's where I want to be precise, because precision is the only thing that's useful at this point in the conversation. Europe is not falling apart. Let's be clear about that. The streets are not empty. The institutions are not collapsing. The quality of life in Copenhagen or Vienna or Zurich remains, by almost any global measure, extraordinary. If you're measuring human well-being in the way that actually touches people's daily lives, safety, healthcare access, social trust, time with family, physical beauty of environment, Europe still leads the world in most of those categories. But that's exactly what makes this moment so difficult to navigate politically. Because the decline we've been describing is not felt as crisis. It's felt as drift, as a slow, barely perceptible loss of position, as a standard of living that isn't collapsing, but isn't rising the way it once did, as young people making quiet decisions to build their lives somewhere else, as companies choosing to scale in markets that aren't European, as decades of accumulated advantage slowly, steadily, quietly eroding. Drift is harder to respond to than crisis. Crisis creates urgency. Crisis breaks the political logjams. Crisis forces the conversation that comfort keeps postponing. Drift just continues. And this is where the historical parallel becomes genuinely instructive. Not to be melodramatic about it, but because history is the only laboratory we have for understanding how these dynamics resolve. Think about Britain in the early 20th century. The British Empire at its peak was the dominant geopolitical and economic force on the planet. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British industry, British finance, British naval power, they organized the global system. And then, over roughly 50 years, that dominance eroded. Not in one catastrophic moment, through a series of structural shifts: American industrial rise, two catastrophically expensive world wars, decolonization, the emergence of new economic powers that compounded into a fundamental repositioning. Britain didn't disappear. Britain remained a significant, prosperous, culturally rich country. It remained a serious economy with serious institutions and serious global influence. But it was no longer the center. The center had moved. Europe today is not facing that exact trajectory. The analogy isn't precise, and I'm not offering it as prediction. But the structural dynamic, a system that dominated a particular era, facing the erosion of the conditions that made that dominance possible, struggling to adapt fast enough, has a recognizable shape. The question for Europe is not whether it will remain significant. It will. The question is whether it will find a way to reorganize itself for the era it's actually in, rather than the era it was built for. And there are reasons, genuine, not just diplomatic, for cautious optimism on specific dimensions. The European defense conversation has shifted more in the past 3 years than in the previous 30. The shock of Ukraine forced a reckoning that years of American pressure had failed to produce. Germany committed to a historic increase in defense spending. Poland is now one of the highest defense spenders in NATO as a percentage of GDP. The European defense industrial base is beginning, slowly, to develop genuine capacity. This matters beyond military terms. Defense investment is industrial policy. It funds research and development. It builds manufacturing capacity. It creates ecosystems of high-skilled employment. The American military-industrial complex was a major driver of technological innovation in the post-war period. GPS, the Internet, advanced materials, countless technologies that became civilian products originated in defense research. European defense investment, if sustained and well-directed, could play a similar role. The energy transition, for all its costs and disruptions, is also genuinely reorganizing European energy in ways that could, over a decade, reduce rather than increase vulnerability. Renewable energy deployment across Europe has been faster than almost anyone projected 5 years ago. Germany, despite its industrial struggles, is generating extraordinary percentages of its electricity from wind and solar. The dependency on Russian gas, while painful to exit, was also a strategic liability that is now being unwound. Energy independence, even if expensive in the short term, is a long-term asset. And the European technology ecosystem, while nowhere near American scale, is developing. Not fast enough, not with enough capital depth, not with the urgency the situation demands, but the foundations are there. The talent is there. The research institutions are there. What's missing is the connective tissue, the capital markets integration, the regulatory harmonization, the cultural shift towards scaling ambition that would allow European innovation to compound rather than leak. The Draghi report, published in 2024, laid out with unusual candor the scale of the investment Europe needs to make in its own competitiveness. Hundreds of billions per year in additional investment in technology, defense, and energy transition. Numbers that would require a level of European fiscal integration that doesn't currently exist, and that northern member states have historically resisted. Whether that report becomes policy or becomes another well-reasoned document filed in the archives alongside all the others, that is perhaps the defining question for European economic history in this decade. Because the window is not infinite. Structural problems that are manageable today become unmanageable tomorrow if the demographic math continues to run, if the productivity gap continues to widen, if the brain drain continues to accelerate, if the political system continues to produce responses that are too small and too slow. Europe has surprised the world before. The post-war reconstruction was one of the most remarkable economic achievements in human history. The creation of the single market, the expansion to include the former communist countries of Eastern Europe, integrating them into a democratic, rules-based system in a generation. That was not inevitable. That required vision and political will that the cynics said didn't exist. It existed, and it produced something real. The cynics may be wrong again. History doesn't move in straight lines. Institutions that look sclerotic can reform under sufficient pressure. Political leaders who look like managers can, in moments of genuine crisis, find the capacity for something larger. But pressure requires a reckoning, and reckonings require honesty about what's actually happening. Which brings us back to where we started, the strange quietness, the drift that doesn't feel like drift from the inside, the cafe that still looks the same, the politician still giving the same speech, the GDP number that still looks respectable, and underneath it, the slow, patient, relentless compound of structural forces that don't announce themselves. Europe knows this story. It has lived versions of it before. The question is whether it will recognize it clearly enough and early enough to write a different ending. I want to leave you with something that isn't a conclusion. Because the honest truth is, this story doesn't have one yet. Europe is not finished. It's not collapsing. It's not becoming irrelevant in the way that apocalyptic narratives suggest. But it is at one of those rare historical inflection points where the direction of the next 50 years gets quietly decided. Not in a single summit, not in a single election, in thousands of small decisions made by governments and companies and young people and investors, accumulating into something that will only be fully visible in retrospect. That's the nature of structural change. It happens before it's announced. And perhaps that's what makes it so difficult to confront. We are wired for events, for moments, for the dramatic turn. We understand crisis. We understand triumph. What we struggle with, what every society struggles with, is the slow, undramatic, unglamorous work of reforming systems that still function well enough to resist reform. Europe built something genuinely worth preserving. Not perfectly, not without contradiction, but something real. A way of organizing collective life that took seriously the idea that prosperity and dignity are not zero-sum. That a society can be both competitive and humane. That efficiency is not the only value worth optimizing for. That idea is worth fighting for. Not romantically, not nostalgically, but seriously, with the same rigor and ambition that built it in the first place. The question Europe is answering right now, whether it knows it or not, is whether it still has the capacity for that kind of seriousness. History doesn't grade on intention, it grades on outcome, and the outcome is still being written. If this conversation meant something to you, share it. Not because the algorithm rewards it, though it does, but because this kind of thinking is rare. And rare things deserve to travel further than they naturally would. Send it to 5 people who think seriously about the world. The kind of people who would rather understand something deeply than have an opinion about it quickly. And leave a comment, not a reaction, a thought. Tell me what you think Europe gets right, that this analysis might have missed. Or tell me what you think comes next. Or tell me what you'd like to understand more deeply. What subject you think deserves this kind of treatment. Because that's how we build something here. Not just a channel. A conversation worth having. I'll see you in the next one.